I was at a research seminar a couple of days ago, and this person who was talking was using the writings of a theorist called Bracha Ettinger, who is kind of, well, I guess she's drawing on psychoanalysis broadly. And I haven't read a lot of psychoanalysis, I've read a little bit, but I've always had a bit of a problem with it. I'm not quite sure why, actually. I guess what the reasons why I started to come more into focus, and it's something to do with its nature as poetry, I think, which I've always had a bit of a problem with, but I'm having kind of a less of a problem with now. When I listen to psychoanalytic writings, Freud or Jung or Adler, or anybody who comes out of that kind of school, really, including Ettinger, and people like Lacan more recently, and the people who've written after Lacan, like kind of Julia Kristeva, that kind of French feminist writing. I always have a problem with it, as I say, because it makes these very, very almost overt use of metaphors. And I say almost overt because they're not quite so overt that if you accept it as poetry. For me, it's always had this suggestion that it's got a foot in some kind of empirical claim, really, or a claim to a certain kind of objectivity, which has always been problematic. I guess the reason why I'm finding it slightly less problematic these days is because I'm starting to reconceptualize objectivity myself as a certain kind of poetry, albeit a collaborative, shared, interpersonal, intuitive poetry. So for that reason, I guess I'm finding psychoanalysis less problematic, because it's just poetry again. It exists in a strange kind of space between, as I said, the poetry of the reality, or the poetry of objectivity, I suppose I should say, and the poetry of the subjective and the phenomenal, or the situated. But nevertheless, that's probably the reason why I'm having less problem with it. The reason why I mention it here is because Ettinger, who I hadn't really come across until, as I say, a few days ago, and I've done a bit of reading and viewing of videos online and stuff since to find out more about what she's got to say. She uses, as I say, quite a lot of fairly standard psychoanalytic poetry, talk of the phallus, and talk of, just that whole panoply of images, really. But one that she has for her own is this concept of matrixial borderspace, which is just a fantastic term, really, matrixial borderspace. And I could talk for minutes. I couldn't talk for hours because I don't know about it. But there's certainly a lot to say about the concept of matrixial borderspace. But one of the things I quite like about it, on first hearing, is the kind of series of metaphorical images and complex relationships between images that it immediately throws up, for me at least. The idea of what a matrix is, the idea of what a border is, the idea of what space is, just kind of cohere in this rather odd, quite dynamic, and by dynamic I mean constantly moving set of images. And the one that's most evident in that construction is the idea of the matrix. And I'm not referring to the film The Matrix, that's something different, I think. But I guess because she's coming out of psychoanalysis, come on you two, it's inevitable that when she talks about matrix, you can't help but think about its origins in the term womb, or the word womb, or the concept of womb. I think she actually says this quite overtly in some of her writings, but certainly its origins in psychoanalysis, as I say, or its applications for psychoanalysis, makes it inevitable that you think about that. The idea of the matrix comes out of the idea of the womb. And so it's almost forgotten that, it's kind of covert. I'm not even sure it is a metaphor now. I think you'd have to kind of know that to get it, really. It's not one of those metaphors that operates non-consciously. But once you know that it has its origins in the womb, then I think it can operate on that level. But what I think is interesting about it is that when we talk about matrices, or the matrix, or the matrixial in general, like the film The Matrix, you don't think of it in terms of enclosure and procreation and the generative and all those kind of associations with the womb. You think of it in terms of things like grids and networks and distribution and connection and extension and the kind of Cartesian, post-Cartesian understanding of space, that kind of decentered, infinite, equal kind of relationships between highly scattered nodes of meaningfulness or something, I guess. At least that's the image that I have. And I think Derrida writes about that actually, but I might be completely wrong. But anyway, so I think in the idea of the matrix, or the matrixial, which is probably lurking in Ettinger's writing, just haven't come across it yet, is this weird apparent paradox of something that's womb-like, which is therefore a container of sorts with a dark space at the centre in which something is almost magically generated, not magically though, but something is expressed and comes into being and separates itself and gets into a kind of I not I relation. Something is doubled and something comes out. So it's all this. It's this image of a highly fecund container with a border on the outside and a kind of centre to its contained insides, some kind of portal through which the things can be expressed. So you have that at the same time as you have this distributed network. So what it's reminding me of, and I haven't really figured a way to really resolve that kind of weird paradox between the highly located and centralizing and the highly distributed and networked, which is why I say it's dynamic. I keep the metaphorical machinery of my mind keeps moving between those images. But what it's kind of reminding me of, and I've mentioned this thing a couple of times, is that aphorism that's attributed to Blaise Pascal to do with the universe, where he says that the universe is a sphere, the centre of which is everywhere and the periphery of which is nowhere, which again is one of those weird dynamic ideas. You kind of go to the idea and then you just find yourself sort of circulating through the ideas, almost as if you can't capture the whole image in one moment, because you kind of don't have enough dimensions to your thought to do that. So you kind of have to use the time dimension to capture it. So you keep moving, you keep feeling that loop of time going through you as you move in the Pascal image between centre and periphery, and trying to figure out what the centre is, and then it leading into the periphery, not leading you back to the centre in this weird kind of Ouroboros knot. So that's what I'm finding with Pascal, and I'm finding a similar thing with this notion of the matrix coming out of Ettinger. It's this weird network which is distributed and infinite and I don't know, scattered or something. But at the same time it's this container which is generative, centered, and obviously like a womb. And again I'm finding that loop between them. So my thoughts will go to the womb, they accept the idea of something container-like and womb-like, and then they immediately lead on to the womb that is everywhere, and every point in that is everywhere. So there's a distributed network of wombs, but every point in that womb is the center of the womb, and every point in that strange generative container is equally capable of expression, and that kind of leads back to the network again. It's a very odd complex of ideas. I'm also aware, of course, that there is a paradox, and I think there's a saying somewhere that the paradox for the philosopher has the same significance as the smell of burning rubber does for the electrician. So I am aware that I might just be kind of in a kind of onanistic loop rather than an Ouroboros knot, trying to resolve the unresolvable rather than trying to use the temporal dimensions as a way of understanding things that are outside of the horizon of my abilities. Anyhow. That's where I've got so. That's not where I've got so far with Ettinger. I read a bit more about that. I'll maybe talk about it at the time. But that's what she threw up immediately. This idea of the matrix and the one. Actually, that's interesting. I must come back to that. The idea that the film The Matrix has this notion of the one.